Hello everyone and welcome to YouTube lecture number 20, The Shadow of War. I thought we'd get right into this lecture, try to make it a short one. There's just a few specific points that I want you to know for Wednesday so we can have a classroom discussion. The essential questions here I have two of them. Why did the U.S. wait until 1941, after nearly every European nation had fallen to Germany, to enter World War II? And what were the sources of American political isolationism? We're going to talk about that here specifically in this video lecture. So let's go ahead and get started. And let's start with something called the London Conference of 1933. You might remember that FDR won the election 1932 in November. He takes the oath of office in March, on March 4th, 1933. The whole world really is in grips of the Great Depression. And England decided to hold this massive world conference. They hold it in their geological museum, and this picture here is the front entrance to this museum, and I like this picture. I think it's really super cool, so I thought I'd put that up there. 66 nations would meet here in London in the summer of 1933. They invite Roosevelt and his new administration also to come join them. And at first Roosevelt says yes, that he would be happy to join. But once he finds out what it is they want to talk about, he eventually says no. See, what the nations of Europe would like to do is talk about exchange rate stabilization and revive world trade. And in order to do that, they would need to make sure that everybody is on a unified gold standard. This is why Roosevelt says no once he finds out they want to talk about the gold standard. If you remember, shortly after taking the oath in March of 33, by April, he has issued an executive order to take America off the gold standard. He wants to have that managed currency going on. And he will not put America back on the gold standard till the following year, and only for trading purposes at that point. So where he originally said yes, he would join the London Conference, once he found out it was about gold, he turns around and says no, which eventually made the London Conference about as useful as the League of Nations, which is about as useful as a box of crackers. So not very useful at all. What it did wind up doing, though, is for certain European countries like Germany and Italy, it allowed them to eventually promote extreme nationalism in order to protect themselves from the effects of the Great Depression. I want to talk to you also what's going on in Congress. You may have remembered there was this little war that happened a few years earlier that everybody called the Great War. The war to end all wars. The war to make the world safe for democracy. Nobody is calling it yet World War I because, again, they're not really sure the sequel's about to come. But they do use the expression World War. Well, a lot of Americans begin to wonder, why did we go into that war in the first place? And along comes a Republican senator, Gerald Nye, the Republican guy. It's a little play on words there. See if you can figure out what I'm trying to make fun of. Senator Gerald Nye begins to investigate this blood business. And he opens up an inquiry within the Senate, and they put together a committee. They begin to investigate over a period of a little more than a year, and they begin to lay blame for World War I on American bankers and American manufacturers of weapons, which he called the merchants of death. And of course, in this blame, Senator Gerald Nye also will blame Woodrow Wilson as lying to the country. Of course, it's easy to blame somebody, I suppose, who's already dead and couldn't defend himself. But this type of rationale now begins to creep within the American political landscape, and a return to isolationism happens, where America wants to isolate itself from European affairs. And you can see this in the political cartoon. Here's Uncle Sam standing on the shores of America, looking across the Great Pond, as the British call it, the Atlantic Ocean. And there's Europe with storm clouds all over it. And Uncle Sam is lamenting here, it ain't what it used to be. You know, things are going bad in Europe. And now Americans want to stay isolated. They want to stay away from this. So throughout the 1930s, a series of neutrality acts get passed. 1935, 1936, 1937, 1939. All of these neutrality acts are aimed to keep America out of any conflicts in Europe and also in Asia. Now, the interesting thing about it is that in these neutrality acts, they don't distinguish between who the victim was and who the aggressor was, which in essence was good for the dictator. The dictator can do whatever he wants, and America doesn't think that they're bad or good. So dictators begin to do bad things. Some of the things that these neutrality acts prohibit, they did not allow the President of the United States to sell any weapons to either belligerent nations. It prohibited any loan or credit to countries at war. It forbade American citizens from traveling to Europe in times of civil unrest and war. Non-military goods, and medicine, clothes, food, could be sold as long as it was on what was called a cash carry situation. In other words, a European country came over here and paid for the goods they wanted, food, medicine, clothing, etc., and took it back on their own ships, cash carry. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about cash carry a little bit more in a few moments. But this specifically, these neutrality acts really hurt a country that was an ally of the United States. And that country was Spain. 1936 and 1931 is the Spanish Civil War. Fascists are trying to take over the Spanish government. America is an ally to Spain, but Roosevelt could do nothing to help the Spanish government because of these neutrality acts. In essence, they handcuffed him. And Spain, an ally to the United States, an ally to England, fell to the fascists. And Adolf Hitler went in there and he helped establish a fascist government. Now, there were some Americans who did volunteer to go over there and fight on their own. They were known as the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. But unfortunately, they couldn't do much. They were completely outnumbered and outgunned. And like I said, Spain will fall to a Spanish dictator. Japan also is doing a lot of things out in Asia. In 1931, they invade Manchuria, which is the northern part of China. And this political cartoon shows you what Japan thinks of all these paper treaties. The Nine Power Treaty, right? And from the 1920s, the Kellogg-Briand Pact that we talked about in our 1920s video, the League of Nations Covenant, the World Court, Japanese government promises that they gave, Shanghai Port Treaties, and they take a big cannon and fire right through it. They don't really care. They're becoming an aggressor out there in Asia. Now, when Hoover is president, his Secretary of State, Henry Stimson, got past what was known as the Stimson Doctrine, 1932. And it simply claimed that the United States will not recognize any territorial claims that Japan has in China that they took by force. All it is a doctrine. Doesn't really say that America will try to help China whatsoever. It's just that they won't recognize any of the territory that they claim. That came out in 1932, and a few months later, Japan then bombed Shanghai. So Japan could care less about the Stimson Doctrine as well. In the meantime, Hitler's doing everything he can to basically take all of Europe. This is a policy that many Europeans practice known as appeasement. Basically allowing Hitler to do whatever he wanted, hoping that that would mean there'd be no war. In 1936, in March of 1936, Germany invades the Rhineland, which is a part of Germany that was given over to France after World War I. Well, he invades it to take it back. Nobody stops him. He winds up leaving the League of Nations, and nobody stops him. His good friend Benito Mussolini in Italy, they invade Ethiopia in 1935, and nobody stops him. They build an army, which you're not allowed to. Nobody stops him. He builds an air force known as a Luftwaffe, which nobody stops him. This is all appeasement, just giving Hitler whatever he wants, hoping that that means he won't actually go to war. Well, in 1938, you have the situation where Hitler now wants parts of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, and England goes into an agreement with Germany and Italy. Of course, they don't even tell the Czechs are going to do this, and they give them the Sudetenland. This is known as the Munich Pact. And England believes that they now have peace in our time. As Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of England, will say, peace in our time has now come, because we have this written agreement from Herr Hitler that if we give him the Sudetenland, he'll be happy. He's taken all these little things, and now he even eventually invades Austria, although the Austrians don't actually put up a fight because Austrians are, in fact, German. So he's gone into Austria, he's gone into the Sudetenland, he's gone into the Rhineland, and nobody is stopping him, and he's doing whatever he wants, and this is called appeasement. In the meantime, America, especially FDR and certain other individuals, can see that there are some problems in the world that are getting out of hand. And while in Chicago, FDR gives a speech that becomes known as the quarantine speech. He's talking specifically about Italy and Japan, though, in this speech, and he talks about there should be an economic quarantine or a boycott on these countries until they stop their aggression. In other words, Japan should get out of China, Italy should get out of Ethiopia, or America will economically quarantine them, boycott them. Well, Chicago is the heart of isolationist America. More isolationists live in Chicago and Illinois than just about anywhere else in America. And they go crazy over this speech. They begin to argue that what FDR has done is basically declared war on Japan and Italy. He's got to back off from this speech. A few days later, he eventually does. He doesn't want to upset too many people. He's in the midst still of the Great Depression and his New Deal and everything that's going on with the Supreme Court. So he does eventually back off from this. But FDR can clearly see, like a lot of smart people, that Adolf Hitler can't simply be tamed by appeasement. And he begins to realize that a war is inevitable. And by 38 especially, FDR has to start thinking, should I run for a third term or not? In 1939, in the beginning of 1939, Germany and the USSR, the Soviet Union, signed the Non-Aggression Pact, basically eliminating any chance of a two-front war between Germany, England, and Russia. And this gave Germany basically the go-ahead to start dropping bombs on Poland September 1st, 1939. When that happens, it is now World War II. FDR would like to help the Allies, but he's not allowed to. So he expands the concept of cash and carry. September of 1939, he gets Congress to agree that as long as England comes over and brings cash or gold and they purchase whatever they want and they carry it back on their own ships, then that's okay for America. Help the Allies now to win so our men will never be necessary. Cash and carry. That becomes like a slogan at the time period, 1939, 1940. America does not want to get involved in that war. But Hitler is blitzkrieging all over Europe. He knocks out Poland, then he goes north, and he invades Denmark, he invades Norway and Sweden, and then he turns his attentions to France. And within a few months, France is knocked out of the war, and England winds up standing alone. By the summer of 1940, it is only England standing up to Adolf Hitler. That brings an end to this video log. Please go on Edmodo to get the video log that goes along with this video, and I'll see everybody tomorrow.